So the panel will start with a contribution from one of the PhD candidates in the Global Studies program, João Silveira. And so after, we will then proceed with the panel with the main speakers. This panel today is on democracy and global security. We will have one of the guests, the guest speakers, will be with us on Skype after the coffee break. So without further delays, I welcome you all and I thank you and I wish all of us a very fruitful day, like the first day, which was already very intense. And the floor is yours, João.
Should I move?
I think we stay here with João.
Okay.
I appreciate not being alone.
But do you have the speaker? Okay.
Yeah.
The microphone.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the Global Studies Conference. I would like to start my intervention by congratulating the organization in the names of Professor Tiago and Professor Margarida, that are here representing the larger efforts to build together these 2 days with wonderful panels. I would also like to welcome the speakers of this panel in the democracy and global security. I think they will certainly bright this morning. And of course, I'd like to congratulate the audience for the courage of waking up earlier on a Saturday and be here. I know it's very, very difficult, at least for me it is. My intervention here today is a combined effort between me and my colleague Pedro, that's over there. And more than introducing a panel, more than introducing the democracy and global security, what we thought it would be interesting was to formulate a few questions that you think they are pertinent in this day and age. So democracy and security, if we look to the current states, are ever growing, intertwined with global events. There's the distinction between what constitutes internal and external dimensions is increasingly blurry. If you think pollution, for instance, in the waters of the Pacific have effects in Europe, in the food security of European states, or African states as well. EU legislation, for instance, they produce effects not just within its member states, but also worldwide in what is become known as the Brussels effect. If you think in the stabilization and economic development of areas such as Horn of Africa or Latin America, these are highly dependent on international interventions or inputs. We live in a fast-changing, technological-driven world that's markedly globalized and interconnected, and national democratic power structures and the well-being of the national communities are affected in multiple levels by formal and informal, state and non-state, international networks and institutions that de facto change the power mechanisms of democratic states and created tensions on our traditional concepts such as sovereignty, national security, or legitimacy are interpreted and relate to one another. We are facing a transition period that some call a state of metamorphosis of human societies. Yet, unlike insects that protect themselves inside cocoons during their metamorphosis, societies have to go through the entire process awake. It's a shift of great challenges that is reshaping the balance and relations between states, populations, business corporations, and international organizations. As in any major change, the fear of what is to come and the fear of the new, of the different, is impelling some social factions to look back to a glorious past that actually never was. For it is something that they know, something that's comforting. We have that. Oh, are you? Okay. We have then those who are ready and willing to take arms against the sea of troubles, and those who desire to resist and change to change. And against this backdrop, that is, I just made it very general, there are multiple challenges to democracy and global security that we believe that we should understand in order to guide democratic societies through these ways of change. Among the challenges, we thought it would be interesting to debate and to send to the audience and to the other speakers three main topics. First, the downfall of critical thinking. Second, weaponization of information. And the last one, the unintelligibility of political systems. What do I mean by all of these? First, we think critical thinking is a crucial element for democratic, economic, technological, and human development. It allows people to question the rules and norms and to innovate in the shoulders of giants. It requires the ability to listen to others, openness to engage in dialogue, and willingness to face and argue the different and what opposes individual convictions. Currently, these traits seem to be in decay. Around the world, radicalism, fanaticism, identity politics are reducing debates to the binomial good-right versus bad-wrong, instead of allowing gradations and subtleties within topics. Additionally, even a small shred of truth is no longer an indispensable condition for debate. And debates with radicals, they usually lean towards character assassination rather than ideas debate. Consequently, free speech, which is one of the foundations of democracy, seems to be shrinking within democracies. And this raises a few questions. First, how can democracy prosper when debates are polarized? Second, how can we diffuse extremist narratives and fight against post-truth radicals? And third one, how to protect and expand places for free and intellectually aggressive debates like this conference here today and yesterday, of course. A second challenge has to do with weaponization of information. Weaponization of information is not something entirely new in the realm of security. For centuries, opposite sides played with propaganda, converted information, and misinformation to advance their agenda and undermine rivals. The tools for such instrumentalization of information have, however, expanded. Powered by the expansion of social media, with algorithms able to show on people's smartphones and laptops targeted information based on their own interests, the effects of misinformation and falsehood dissemination can now be massified with greater precision. Beyond the security realm, the weaponization of information leaked to political and social spheres, undermining truthiness, trust, and sources of correct information. Because people have now the ability to see only what they are interested in and comfortable with, living in a kind of personal bubble, and because they lack the tool to distinguish between correct and incorrect information, traditional mechanisms to counter misinformation, such as fact-checkers, seem to be inefficient. And we have a few questions related to the weaponization of information. The first is, how can we stop the spread of falsehood and misinformation in the current hyper-connected social media environment? The second question we formulated is, which tools will allow for an efficient and timely deconstruction of falsehoods? And the last one, how can democracy cope with this type of aggression? The third challenge, and the one with which I end my remarks, refers to the unintelligibility of political systems. The unintelligibility of political systems derives from the multiplicity of decision centers affecting the lives of citizens. These are multi-level, asymmetric, drawn from different types of legitimacy, are different in their nature, produce different inputs on policy making, and have different degrees of public engagement. This architecture is extremely complex, and power divisions are sometimes hard to grasp. Average citizens do not understand who are the holders of power, neither who can better represent them on different aspects of their lives. They still engage mainly with national states, whose powers have been dispersed by a great array of actors. Consequently, populations feel misrepresented, powerless, and alienated in a system often perceived as unfair, unequal, opaque, and illegitimate. And this raises the following questions. How can we create new narratives that explain, simplify, and approximate populations to power structures? And how can we develop different legitimation systems applicable to different actors that operate and affect decision making? With these questions, I end my intervention. Thank you all for your attention, and I now invite you to listen to the other speakers that are much more important than me.
So we will now continue with the reminder that the other members of the panel, and we will start with Daniel Ziblatt. I'm just going to introduce him briefly. Many of you would know his work, would know him, but anyhow, it's always important to introduce you to Daniel Ziblatt. É professor na Universidade de Harvard. Os interesses de investigação e ensino incidem sobre democratização, construção do Estado, política comparada e economia política em perspectiva histórica, com um particular enfoque na Europa. É autor de diversas obras, entre as quais How Democracies Die, and this is published in 2018, so we are quite fortunate to have the author with the opportunity to discuss his new book, Conservative Parties and the Birth of Democracy, do ano passado, e Structuring the State, the Formation of Italy and Germany, and the Puzzle of Federalism. Without further delays, the floor is yours, Daniel, Professor Daniel Ziblatt. Very welcome to Lisbon. Yes. We will have papers of 20 minutes so that we guarantee that we have enough room for the debate after the coffee break in the end of the panel. So please, Daniel.
Thank you very much. So it makes me a little nervous to have an introduction in a language I don't understand, but I assume that you only said nice things about me. Thank you,
we have
everyone.
The translation.
Yeah, thank you for being here, and thank you for having me here. I'm really happy to have a chance to talk. And so following up on these remarks, I think these three topic areas that you just mentioned of the critical thinking, the weaponization of information, and unintelligibility of political systems. I was trying to think of how my comments fit into this, and in some ways maybe on the last point, but I sort of think of my comments being about the state of democracy and thinking about political institutions. And if we think of political institutions as being buffers or mechanisms of withstanding these kinds of pressures, that's sort of what I'm going to be talking about today. So just to start with a big picture, I mean, throughout the Cold War, it was very common, a myth, I guess, for the West was that democracy would be the endpoint of evolution. Of course, things have not really worked out that way, I would say, over the last 25 years fully. I mean, for many stable democracies face all sorts of internal challenges, internal pathologies. And these pathologies don't come in the form, though, of military coups or military revolutions. Or revolutionaries. These come in the form today, I would argue, under a bunch of labels, including populist authoritarian, nationalist populist, far-right populist. These terms are difficult, though, when we think about democracy, because after all, the foundation of democracy is the notion of popular sovereignty. So when populists claim to speak for the people, the populist movement succeeds in coming to power, doesn't it have the right to rule as it would like? Isn't that the very meaning of democracy? So this is a classic and an old dilemma, and I'm going to talk about that dilemma today. This is I was asked to talk about my book that's just come out, How Democracies Die, and this dilemma is one of the themes of the book, and so I'm just going to talk about this dilemma. And the dilemma, again, is if democracy is about the rule of the people, who are we to judge if a populist demagogue comes to power and attacks democracy? And I think in our current age, the challenge in an age of electoral authoritarians, when authoritarians come to power through elections, a dilemma and a challenge is how can these types of figures be kept out of power in a way that's consistent with democracy? So my comments will really focus on this dilemma. So let me first begin by giving you a description of the motivation behind why I wrote this book with my co-author, Steve Levitsky. So my co-author and I, Steve Levitsky, we're both scholars of comparative politics. So I study European politics. Steve, my co-author, studies Latin American politics. And we've spent our careers mostly studying democracies in crisis, mostly me in Europe historically, Steve in Latin America in the 1960s and 70s. And so we were motivated to write this book, though, by the unfolding election campaign in the United States. And we were shocked at first and then increasingly worried at the tenor of the political debate. Because we had spent much of our lives studying democracies in crisis elsewhere, there was this added level of worry. So it was first really small echoes. During the presidential campaign, the Republican nominee for President, Donald Trump, railed against the media. He said he wouldn't necessarily accept the results of the elections. He at one point said that his rival was a criminal and deserved to be locked up. I mean, these are all now quite famous. He condoned violence at election rallies, often joking. It's not. We're not sure how. People weren't sure how serious to take this. But for Steve and I, this was very worrying because we were very influenced by the great political scientist Juan Linz, who in the 1970s proposed what he called a litmus test, a set of characteristics that if political leaders pass the litmus test, this is a sign that they might become authoritarians. And Donald Trump passed this litmus test with flying colors. Again, going after the media, challenging the legitimacy of elections, challenging the legitimacy of his political opponent, and condoning violence. These are the hallmarks of an authoritarian. So this made us very worried. Now, again, many people thought this was just talk, but what we recognized was that at no point in 20th century American political history had the candidate for president from a major political party behaved in this way. And we also recognized that politicians in other countries had behaved this way, and that usually did not end well. So we had this feeling that we had seen this movie before, and we usually knew the ending of the movie was not so wonderful. So we realized we had to write this book, and we wanted to understand how other countries facing similar crises had overcome these crises, and why other countries had succumbed to these crises. We thought we could draw lessons for the United States. So one of our conclusions, and that's really what I'm going to emphasize today, is that the rise of Donald Trump, we argue, is not really just due to mass disaffection from politics. It's not about, there's not a mass disaffection from democracy, I would argue, in the United States. That in many ways, the way that electoral authoritarians come into power, and I think Donald Trump in this sense mirrors electoral authoritarians around the world, is through a failure of political elites. There's a failure of elite what we call gatekeeping. And that the rise of Donald Trump can be laid at the blame can be laid at the feet of our political parties. So how do we get to this conclusion? So the starting point, in a way, is a simple observation that the best way to keep an authoritarian to prevent them from coming to power, the best way to stop an authoritarian is to prevent them from coming into power in the first place. So what this means in the context of the United States is we shouldn't just focus on why he was elected president, but also why he ever became the nominee of one of the two major parties in the first place. So as I said at the beginning, during the Cold War, the way that most democracies died was through military coups. I mean, 3/4 of democratic breakdowns during the Cold War came through military coups. Since the collapse of communism, most democratic breakdowns arrive at the ballot box through elections. So demagogues come to power in elections, and once in power, they inflict serious damage on democratic institutions. So again, this paradox is, how does a democracy prevent an autocrat from coming into power in the first place? Now, this is a dilemma that the United States has happily avoided through most of its history. But this is not a dilemma that was avoided because there were no would-be demagogues in American history, or that there weren't people who were willing to support demagogues. And in fact, we Americans have a tendency, I think, to whitewash our own history and to forget that there's really nearly a continuous strand of would-be authoritarians who find remarkable amounts of support. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. This begins in the 20th century with Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Motor Company, who was cited in the Mein Kampf very favorably by Hitler. Was a famous anti-Semite who considered running for president in 1924. And there was opinion surveys and surveys of magazines, readers of magazines done, which he was gaining around 30% approval ratings from the American public. He decided not to run for office. The 1930s, there was another authoritarian, Huey Long, who was governor of Louisiana, then became senator from Louisiana, who ended up not running for president. Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s, George Wallace, a segregationist in the 1960s. Gallup opinion poll data goes back to the 1930s, and we can see around 30% of voters approved each of these guys. And in many ways, this is a figure that's consistent with the 35% that support Donald Trump today. So I think it's actually not too much to say that there's a continuous strand of authoritarianism running through American political culture, as in probably most countries. So here's the point, though, that none of these other figures that I just mentioned ever made it close to the presidency. Though they were popular, they were kept far from power. So how were they kept far from power, and what changed in 2016? So in our book, we emphasize two contributing factors. that we describe more fully. So I'll just describe them very briefly here this morning. First, the way that we've picked presidents in the United States has changed. So until 1972 in the United States, and for the first 3/4 of the 20th century, presidential candidates were selected by party leaders who worked up close with party candidates. So these party conventions were usually opportunities for party leaders to get together to find a candidate who they thought would win the election. Some political scientists have described this as a system of peer review, where people who are experts in the process of getting elected would choose the best candidate. Party primaries, so the selection of candidates through primaries, were in effect irrelevant in this period, in the first 3/4 of the 20th century. It was really party candidates who picked candidates, and parties were in this sense gatekeepers. Voters, of course, mattered at the general election, but voters were irrelevant in the primary season. So this system has been called, quite accurately, a system of smoke-filled back rooms, where political leaders get together, smoking cigars, decide on the candidate. I mean, this is in many ways a very corrupt system. It's exclusive. It kept out many people. And so I'm not arguing that there should be a return to this. But until 1972, this was a system that actually worked quite well, in fact, perfectly, at keeping extremist demagogues from the top of party tickets. The extremists were never viable candidates before 1972. So it was a screening system, a kind of filtration system, a gatekeeping system that kept demagogues out of power. Now, American politics changed in many ways in 1968. This is my time here.
You still have
yes. Okay.
10 minutes.
Okay, great. So we know American history changed in many ways in 1968, tragic year of 1968, but it also changed in the way we select our presidential candidates in the United States. This presidential system was opened up. The smoke-filled rooms were opened up. Primaries, where voters had a say in selecting candidates, was now binding. And voters could pick their candidates. And so now, before the general election, there's a long system that all Americans are familiar with of a long, continuous primary season where state-by-state voters are choosing candidates. Now, this certainly, again, was a more open system and in many ways a more desirable system. But what's interesting is even at the time that this passed in the early 1970s, this was originally reforms in the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party, political scientists warned that this fall of this filtration system could also open the door to demagogues. Now again, to be clear, I'm not arguing that we go back to the old system. But at the same time, we need to recognize that all system, and current system as well, is double-edged. It was more open, but if a demagogue ever decided to run for the nomination, the road would be much clearer for him or her to do that. So to cope with this, in the 1980s, the Democratic Party introduced a system called superdelegates, where party leaders continued to have some say in the selection of candidates. Around 15% of the delegates were party leaders. The Republican Party never selected such a system. So this left the door completely open within the Republican Party. And this also meant that if a demagogue ever decided to run for president, especially in the Republican Party, without this system of superdelegates, the road would be much more open for him. And this is exactly what happened in 2016. Donald Trump, a modern-day demagogue, I would argue, became the nominee of the Republican Party. But there's a second factor. So first, the way we select our presidents has changed. Second big factor that we elaborate in the book, the second kind of check that did not work in 2016, and I think this is actually a more important point, in fact, was the following. We have to think that even after Donald Trump won the nomination, it was clear he wasn't necessarily going to become president. I mean, he could have been defeated by Hillary Clinton, but even just as important, I would argue, is that there was an imperative role to be played by his Republican Party allies. And here's really the central pivot, I think, of the story. Authoritarians come to power, electoral authoritarians, not on their own, but with the enabling aid of political allies from the political establishment. So this is not just the United States. This repeats itself throughout history. I mean, we can take some historical examples. Italy in the 1920s, Germany in the 1930s, Venezuela in the 1990s. I'll just briefly describe those cases. I mean, there's a crucial test comes along when a demagogue comes along who clearly violates democratic norms, and they get close to power. One of the last off-ramps is whether or not establishment politicians or party allies break with the autocrat in the making. Do they draw a line and say, beyond this we will not go? Or do they abdicate, overlook democratic violations, and let their commitment to party trump their commitment to democracy? and form a kind of Faustian bargain, allowing their ideological ally, but a potential autocrat in the making, into power. So do they enable the authoritarian? So when an elected authoritarian gets into power, at this last stage, it's nearly always because mainstream politicians out of opportunism or miscalculation, let the autocrat in the door. So the enabling role, again, of the Republican Party is actually not unique. It happens quite often. So in Venezuela in the 1990s, Hugo Chavez got his political start by being given a big boost from the longtime fixture of Venezuelan politics, Rafael Caldera, who had been president himself and who was sort of at the end of his career, and saw Chavez on the stage, freed him from jail, gave Chavez a boost in legitimacy, and Caldera hoped to tap into some of Chavez's energy, electoral energy, and support for Chavez and popular appeal. Within several years, Chavez was president and Caldera was long gone. In Italy in the 1920s, famously, Giovanni Giletti included Mussolini on a party list of the liberals in the early 1920s, giving Mussolini a boost in legitimacy, and again, within a year, Mussolini was in power and Giletti was gone. And maybe the most provocative example of this is Weimar Germany, where in the late 1920s, the Conservative Party, the German Conservative Party, was being led by a group of aristocrats without much mass base, saw Hitler on the far right and thought that there's right-wing energy to be tapped into, and began to issue joint proclamations with the Nazi Party, joint political rallies, and within several years, of course, Hitler was in power, the conservatives were long gone, and kind of one of the most provocative, again, moments in January 1933, when von Papen was trying to reassure his conservative allies to not be worried about Hitler. He had this incredible quote where he said, "Don't worry, within 2 months we'll have pushed him," talking about Hitler, "so far into a corner that he'll squeal." In every instance, though, mainstream politicians open the door. They fail in their gatekeeping function out of, again, miscalculation, opportunism, and they let extremists in the door. And in every instance, mainstream politicians make the same mistake. They think this is a Faustian bargain, and they think they can draw upon the enthusiastic support of the outsider, and they think they can control the outsider. But in every instance, the bargain backfires. So maybe of a different scale, but I think a very similar dynamic unfolded in the United States in 2016. Republicans who openly despised Donald Trump, Republican Party leaders, endorsed him, supported him. You know, one thinks they could have, for instance, endorsed his political rival, Hillary Clinton. They could have crossed party lines, but they did not. They could have put democracy, I would argue, above party. Not a single leading Republican politician who was running for re-election endorsed Hillary Clinton. Now, you might think, well, this is naive. You know, are these guys really going to support somebody of the other party? Well, I think it turns out you don't actually have to look too far. In the French presidential election in 2017, I mean, it's a slightly different dynamic, but similar. François Fillon, of course, didn't make it to the second round. And rather than staying silent in the second round or endorsing Le Pen, he endorsed Macron. So, you know, he crossed. I mean, it's different. Obviously, there's other parties involved, but in some sense, Le Pen may have been ideologically more proximate. Who knows? But in any case, Fillon did something which was to endorse another party candidate and drew lots of voters to Macron. In the United States, Republicans did not do this. They let the United States' Le Pen in the door, and Donald Trump was elected president. So I will conclude then with just a couple of observations. Number one, I mean, certainly American democratic institutions are stronger and more robust than Venezuela, Hungary, Turkey. I mean, I don't want to make the kind of too overly loose comparison to these countries. But I think on the other hand, the U.S. is facing a similar dynamic where there's been an election of somebody who has displayed a weak commitment to democratic norms. The worst damage has been contained, I would argue, by this American system of checks and balances. But the fact that there's an active debate now in the United States over how authoritarian is Donald Trump or not shows that the selection mechanism of our political system has broken to allow this guy in the door. And I would argue, just as a final point, that it's really, again, not, there's maybe mass disaffection, but I think there's often been, throughout American history, high levels of mass disaffection. There's always been demagogues. There's always been support for demagogues. What changed this time was the political system broke and this person came through the door. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting first paper. We will continue this conversation. You were extremely disciplined. Thank you so much with your time management.
Yes.
So this is important so that we can have some time for debate. I will introduce Professor Tiago Fernandes. Many of his students are here. He's a professor at the Department of Political Studies and head of department. He's the author of several books, some as co-author, others monographs. Neither dictatorship nor revolution, the liberal wing, thank you, and the period of Marxism, 1968-74. Civil Society, this one was published in 2014, and Democracies in Southern Europe, 1968 until 2016. I also have here another book which was published in 2017, where he's a co-author and editor, Late Neoliberalism and its Discontents in the Economic Crisis, and Tiago Fernandes contributes with a chapter on the Portuguese case study. Without further delays, Tiago, thank you so much for being here with us, and the floor is yours.
I would like to thank Diogo Camada Curto, Margarida Marques, Alexandra, and also participants for organizing this conference. And I'm really happy to be here and to see so many students and colleagues and friends. So what I'm going to talk about, it's, as you can see from the title, about the organizational sources of social resilience and progressive governance, Portugal in the age of austerity. I'm making a link to what Daniel was talking about during this presentation. And as you know, we, in this age of late neoliberalism, a term coined by some authors, Wolfgang Streeck, Colin Crouch, Donatello Della Porta, we do face a critical juncture that poses several challenges to democracy. And one of them, especially in Southern Europe, was the impact of the economic crisis since the fall of the Lehman Brothers in 2007, which has spread out to Southern Europe and has created a big turmoil in terms of a total reshaping of the political systems of the Southern European democracies. You see that in Greece. Greece is probably the most dramatic case of democratic crisis, with the total erasing of the old party system and the birth of conquering power of a kind of a left-wing populist political movements. You see that in Spain. Spain clearly, and now with the recent crisis in Catalonia, has passed from a bipartisan system to a four-party system with new challengers, both on the right, the Ciudadanos, and on the left, Podemos. And now, during the Catalan crisis, Spain has clearly, and this links to what Daniel was saying about the US case, has clearly limited several basic civic freedoms. Parliamentary sovereignty of the Catalan parliament in being able to nominate the legitimate government, and limitations on the strike of demonstration, the right of demonstration, the right to strike. So the interesting point, I think, that when one looks at the period from, say, the 2007-8 to the present day, the last, say, decade in Southern Europe, is that the Portuguese case stands out as a puzzling case because of partly what has not happened and what has happened as a good sign in terms of contributing to deepening of democracy. On the one hand, the crisis was felt to be quite severe here, but not as much as any other Southern European cases, even cases which were not under financial assistance. So Italy and Spain, which were not under financial assistance by the Troika, did behave, did show a much worse sorry, skipping the word. Did show a much less, sorry, did suffer much less from the impact of the crisis than Portugal compared to the other countries in terms of socioeconomic welfare of the population. The second, so this is a puzzle. Why under the Troika assistance was, levels of unemployment, poverty, youth unemployment, inequality not as high as any other country. So this is what, to use Peter Hall and Michel Lamont's terms, is about social resilience. And socially and economically, the Portuguese case showed much more resilience than any other Southern European case. The second aspect is in the aftermath of the crisis, there's a formation of a government which is quite unique in terms of Southern European democracies compared to other, and even in Western Europe. It's the only country in Western Europe which has a government clearly defending a political agenda, rejecting neoliberalism. It's composed of quite a unique combination of political parties. The center-left, a minority center-left, ruled by the Socialist Party, in an alliance with two radical left-wing parties, the Communist Party and the Left Bloc. And this is quite unique. I mean, it's as if, in Spain, we were talking about this the other day, the socialists had allied with Podemos and the small communist party there, the Izquierda Unida, or in Germany, the Social Democrats had allied with the radical left and with the Greens. This has happened. It has not happened anywhere, and this government has developed a series of progressive politics aiming at, giving more power and resources to popular groups in society. So it's a totally counter-cyclical type of government compared to other countries. Okay, so this is just a brief, I think I'll skip this. It's Portugal under austerity between April 2010 and 2015. There were two governments who implemented some pro-austerity policies, and basically the main also pro-austerity government was between 2011 and October 2015. During the Troika's assistance, the center-right government, a coalition of the PSD and CDS, the two main center-right political parties, negotiated a 78 billion agreement between the Troika, composed of the European Central Bank, the European Community, and the IMF, in exchange for a series of cuts in the welfare state and other neoliberal policies. But what is I do think one should highlight here is that the aim of the government, as the Prime Minister then said, was to go beyond the Troika, to be more liberal than the neoliberal policies espoused by the European Commission and the IMF, which were already quite neoliberal from the start. With Pedro Passos Coelho, we aim to go beyond the Troika, as he said, in the start of his government, and also to revise the basic institutions and basic understandings of what the Portuguese democracy meant to be since established in the 1975 Constitution. I mean, Passos Coelho did want to get rid of the provisions in the Constitution that guarantee free access to health, free access to universal health care, universal teaching for every kid until the university, basic schooling guaranteed by the state, and also all the provisions that you have in the Constitution that protect workers from arbitrary dismissals from employers. So it was also a change in the basic understanding of what democracy is by the political right, by the center right, and it's also an innovation, I would say. Now, so the first puzzle is the lower impact of neoliberal policies in Portugal. So these data, I compare here Portugal with Italy because it's interesting how Portugal performs better than Italy or less worse during the crisis, being Italy the most economically developed Southern European country. So and it wasn't under assistance. So you can Portugal performs better in most indicators. Economic growth is better. Debt is equal between Italy and Portugal. Long-term unemployment is almost equal in 2014. And the severe material deprivation rate in Italy is only slightly better than Portugal. Risk of poverty is slightly better than in Italy, in Portugal, which was under assistance at the time. youth unemployment, etc. So I'll skip this, but so this is GDP growth in Italy and Portugal. As you can see, Portugal after 2013 already under a system was growing more than Italy. The long-term unemployment, as you can see, Portugal since 2005 is always ahead of Italy. And there's a slight decline in the 2012 to 2013, but still ahead of Italy. And the last data, Portugal is already below the two-digit unemployment rate. I mean, it's unique in Southern Europe too. This is the severe material deprivation rate. Here, Italy is slightly better than Portugal, but it's quite unique. I mean, I show these two countries only because if one compared Portugal with Spain or Greece, I mean, the gap would be even worse.
Wait, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the last one was showing that Portugal's worse off, and in this one you're saying that this is showing that Italy's worse off, or what? I can't.
No, this one, Portugal, is more or less similar to Italy. So you would expect it to be much worse than Italy, right? And differences. Yeah. Either Portugal is on the level of Italy or better than Italy. So this is the risk of poverty, more or less similar in both countries. You would expect it Portugal to be, Youth unemployment, Portugal is much lower than Italy, and it's declining. It's been declining continuously. Now, so this is the second puzzle. So in the aftermath of the crisis, there's the formation of a left-wing government coalition with an egalitarian and anti-liberal program. I mean, this is a series of puzzles from Portugal. So this new government, as I said, is supported by a parliamentary agreement between the socialists and the communists and the left bloc, which is the radical left. It's a unique phenomenon in Western Europe where most socialist and social democratic parties are indicated. There's no populist left or right parliamentary representation in Portugal compared to any other Western European democracy. There's the stability of the party system contrary to Spain, Greece, and France. I mean, basically we have the same party system which we have inherited from the 74-75 revolution. It's total organizational continuity. And it's the first time, and this is an innovation, that in Portuguese history that the radical left has supported the governmental budget and been integrated into the Council of State. So one could argue that the two radical left parties, which represent more or less 20% of the electorate, during the crisis and the challenges that the crisis posed to Portuguese democracy, led to a situation where there was further integration of popular groups by incorporating the parties that represent these groups in a government coalition for the first time, and thereby deepening democracy instead of eroding democracy, as you see in other places like Greece or Spain. So these are the policies. I'm going to pass on that. So privatization plans for public transportation and water have been cancelled. Minimum wage and pensions have been raised. There's a 35 working week for public hour working week for public employees. Free textbooks for primary schools and reduction of tuition. Universal access to preschooling to children more than 3 years old. Same-sex marriage approved. More progressive fiscal system is under discussion still, and increases in public investment in science and education. End of precarious work contracting the state, but also in some private sectors. Protection of access to housing to families in case of debts to banks. Contrary to Spain, you can't get kicked out of your house if you indebted to the bank. You can't pay the mortgage. And cheaper energy. I mean, these are some examples of the policies which have been pursued, and they're counter-cyclical to what's happening in most Western. Now, so what explains this? How much time do I have? 8 minutes? Okay, so there's several competing theories out there, and so what explains this singularity and or in a continuum from crisis of democracy, say represented, I would say, in Southern Europe, clearly by Spain at the present moment, and also the US, and in the other extreme, one could put Portugal, eventually France, still with the new election by Macron, this new movement, eventually contributing to some, stabilization and even probably some deepening of democracy. I mean, it depends how things evolve. So what could explain this? One is, I mean, you have these series out there, magnitude of protest. The more people protest throughout, periods of turmoil, economic crisis, the more they go to the streets and, try to impose their rights and make the government accountable to inequality and try to make them reduce inequality and develop policies or bring down right-wing governments that implement or left-wing governments that implement neoliberal policies, the more progressive will be the outcome in terms of recomposition of the political system. Well, although it grew, I won't give any data. I have the data there in the book, and I won't waste time showing that data. But Portugal, although it had more protest events and more people protesting in the streets, overall, the amount of protest was actually the lowest in Southern Europe. So, I mean, it's not the amount of protest or the amount of people on average, protesting throughout a certain period that explains this, because Spain, Greece had much more protest events than Portugal, or more a higher percentage of the population protesting. A second theory which has been developed for the analysis of previous economic crises in Latin America, it's Ken Roberts' theory on Latin America. So he argues that Ken Roberts, political scientist at Cornell University, has wrote a book about 2 years ago on the impact of the economic crisis in 8 Latin American countries, the 2000 crisis, and the reshaping of democratic institutions in the aftermath of the crisis. An amazing book. And he argues that if the center-left party adopts neoliberal policies, thus going against its ideological tradition and implements austerity, it will provoke a drastic realignment of the electorate, which, in conjunction with huge popular waves of protest, will lead to the collapse of the existing party system, in the end to be replaced by populist party governments. So that's basically what happened in Venezuela that Daniel was talking a while ago, where, or partly in Peru, but has not happened in Brazil or Uruguay. So there, in Brazil and Uruguay, the main center-left parties kept, faithful to their ideological tradition and did not, for whatever reason, contextual reasons, opportunistic reasons, pressure from abroad, from the IMF, from the United States, international organizations, and so on, did not implement neoliberal policy, so the system was more or less kept intact, because that doesn't provoke, a drastic realignment and shifting in the electoral identity, the identities of the electorate, thus giving an opportunity to, mainly in the case of Latin America, left-wing populist candidates to, conquer parts of the available electorate that's, becoming dispersed and, as breaking their allegiances and identity to the main established party. Now, this is a valid argument, and although it explains some variations, for instance, among Portugal, post-2013, Spain and Greece, it is true that the Socialist Party in Portugal is more left-leaning than the Socialist parties in Spain and Greece. And that's probably one of the reasons why they almost disappeared in Greece. I think they were like 7 or 8% of the vote. In Spain, they 20% of the vote. They're more or less equal to Podemos, the radical left party. In Portugal, they're above the 30%. I mean, and making, believing in the latest polls, they could reach easily the 40% mark in the next general elections, which is quite unique also in Western Europe. You don't have a center-left party behaving so well. But his argument has two limitations. One is it does not account for other types of variation. So, for instance, 2011 and the behavior of the Socialist Party during the start of the crisis was actually in espousing also neoliberal policies. Actually, it was the Socialist Party signed an agreement with the Troika. So the first, José Sócrates, the previous prime minister before the war, it did implement neoliberal policies under pressure by the EU. So, so the Socialist Party has a shifting identity over time, contrary to what Roberts would say. And France, it doesn't explain the case. France, if you bring in France into the picture, you do have a big change in the party system with the election of Macron, and you don't really, I don't think you could classify the Socialist Party in France as implementing drastic neoliberal policies as they did in Greece or in Spain. Although it's considered kind of a center-left party, I do think that it's still more geared to the left, and in that respect more closer to the Portuguese system when you compare it with the other countries. And also it fails to account for the origins of these different ideological approaches among the socialist parties. I mean, why would the socialist parties behave so differently from country to country? Why? I mean, is it just strategic calculation, or is it something else that it's part of the story of these countries and the process that develops throughout the democratic period in each society? And then that's why one could look at another theory, which is democratization pathways by Robert Fishman, which he argues that, I'll just have for two more minutes, okay? Degenerate cultural legacies that shape future governments' policies, and the degree to which political elites are open to protests from below. So he argues that revolutionary pathways to democracy result, in the long run, in a more open political system. That would be Portugal. Whereas packed and elite-led transitions result in an elite political culture which is more close to popular demands. He looks at the case of Spain. Now, I would argue that this argument does not explain the right-wing party's aim to go beyond the Troika. So, I mean, one would expect the political right to be more moderate and not to be so harsh in implementing neoliberalism as it was. I mean, but what happened in Portugal is that the political right broke up with the tradition of a supposedly elite consensus of listening to the voices of the people, pressures from below. Right? Pressures from below. And I think this argument is too much focused on elites and institutions. So I develop an additional argument, which is the organizational and cultural legacies of the long cycle of protest of the 60s from the 70s. And this was a major critical juncture in all Western Europe, where you did have democratization in the Southern European countries and re-democratization through long periods of social protest and social movement building in Southern Europe. May 68, the led years in Italy, and the turmoil in the 60s and 70s. And these legacies left in the social movement field, specifically in Portugal, the propensity to form broad progressive fronts. Protest movements in Portugal during the austerity and throughout the democratic period tend to form cohesive organizations, create stable and broad coalitions, to have a national scope, and to establish alliances with unions and center-left and radical-left political parties. So this is what I try to argue, and I won't go much further this because I'm out of time. Throughout the democratic period since the 60s, for some historical reason, which I'll briefly try to explain in half a minute, in major moments of democratic crisis, and so for instance, dramatic presidential elections, cycles of protest, Portuguese democracy, the main social movements, unions, and the three left-wing parties tend to join together in progressive, networks, platforms that, after the critical moment has passed, they tend to disband, and things they return to normal competition during more settled times. But in crisis times, there's a realignment of the left with the center and with social movements in broad progressive fronts. And this is what happened during the austerity. I mean, austerity was stopped in one of these situations with a big platform that encompassed a big part of the Socialist Party, all established elites in the left, all presidents of the left, also all major social movements, precarious movements, the two main union confederations in the, as you recall, big demonstrations that happened in Portugal from the end of from the summer of 2012 throughout the beginning of 2013, called Screw the Troika, Slicha Troika. That's called the Screw the Troika platform, where all these people, these movements and parties got together and they mobilized probably the biggest demonstration in Southern Europe, which had 1 million people in the streets throughout during 3 or 4 days, and it basically stopped austerity from them. Now, so this is what I want to say. Sorry for taking more
We
time.
got carried away listening to Professor Tiago Fernandes. We will continue the conversation for sure. We've zoomed in, so we started with a more broad comparative politics perspective. We zoomed in with a Portuguese case study, and now we'll do a different kind of exercise, trying to zoom out and bring in an international relations perspective. Professor James Mayall will be offering us a paper on globalization, nationalism, and security. But before advancing to the paper and to hearing to his paper, I will just briefly introduce you to some of his works. I will introduce you in Português, so you will excuse me. Professor James Mayall é professor jubilado em Relações Internacionais no Sydney Sussex College da Universidade de Cambridge. Tem várias publicações sobre relações internacionais, Estados africanos, relações Norte-Sul, teoria internacional e o nacionalismo nas relações internacionais. Uma das suas obras mais conhecidas e mais trabalhadas também por nós é o Nacionalismo and International Society, publicado pela Cambridge University Press em 1990, que ganhou o prémio da Associação de Estudos Políticos pela melhor monografia publicada nesse ano. Tem continuado a desenvolver a sua pesquisa, publicações, orientado centenas de doutorandos e doutoramentos. Eu sou uma das alunas por si orientadas sobre vários temas, entre os quais ressurgimento de conflitos étnicos, nacionais, religiosos, desde o fim da Guerra Fria e também as respostas a estes conflitos armados. Em 96 editou o livro The New Interventionism 1998-1994, United Nations Experience in Cambodia, former Yugoslavia and Somalia. Em 2000 publicou World Politics, Progress and Its Limits e atualmente está a trabalhar na publicação de um livro que brevemente nos falou ontem no painel sobre Empires in Global History. Este livro é intitulado Empires of the Mind, The Debate Between Order and Justice in an Age of Anxiety. Professor James Mayall, my dear supervisor, thank you so much for being here with us, and the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Alexandra, and I'm very glad that was in Portuguese, because otherwise I should be even more embarrassed than I am already, particularly as I feel on this panel a bit fraudulent. How, like Daniel, how do I fit in to these three areas of interest? Probably, again, to the last one. I mean, at a time when most of the problems in the world, as the title of our seminar suggests, cross boundaries with the ease of the mosquito or the tsetse fly, we seem to be stuck in a world of nationalism and nation states, and a lot of the unintelligibility and incoherence stems from that contradiction, I think. And of course it raises huge questions about the future of nationalism. Will it wither away in a kind of mirror image of Marx's prediction? Or will it once again, as been suggested a lot yesterday, and indeed by Daniel in a way, will it become, for the second time, the avatar of the far right? Or is there a chance that it can develop and be used as a resource to remodel international society and direct it towards more equitable and harmonious ends? And these are huge, topical but huge questions, and I can't claim the competence to answer them, but I'd like to sort of contribute by starting a conversation about how the relationship between nationalism and globalization has evolved, and ask if there's anything possible, anything sensible that we can say about how it might develop into the future. And to do that, I want to take two very short histories of the world. I was trained as a historian a long time ago and have long since forgotten. And Henry Ford has been mentioned. The problem with history is it's one damn thing after the other, isn't it? I mean, it goes on and on and on, and how do you cut the cake? So very short histories of the world have a certain appeal to me. And there are two that I want to use to try and launch this discussion. The first one was attributed to the British 19th century jurist Sir Henry Maine, who traced the change from a world dominated by status to one dominated by contract. And the second one, my version of it is taken from Ortega y Gasset, the Spanish Minister of Culture in the Republican government just before the Civil War, and who viewed the history of the world through a sociological lens, throwing light on the history of freedom, once only enjoyed by an absolute ruler, then by a narrow, privileged elite, and finally, at least in theory, by everyone. Well, under the first story, a combination of long-distance trade and religious expansion helped to integrate the known world, but also provided experience of social, cultural, and political differences. In the world of status politics, politics was conducted by a small elite who alone possessed political identity, although even for them it was conditioned more by their loyalty to those immediately above them in the social hierarchy than by ethnicity or culture, let alone by political nationalism, which didn't then exist. Of course, the mass of the population lived amongst their own kind, spoke its language, and celebrated its folk ways. My former colleague and much great distinguished guru, in a way, Ernest Gellner, used to say that when he was growing up in what was then Czechoslovakia, he used to enjoy dancing. And it was only after he had become a student of and a theorist of nationalism that he learnt that it was folk dancing that he was enjoying. But the point is that although you lived amongst your own people, you spoke their language, you celebrated their ways, the vast majority of people for the vast stretches of time were political objects, pawns on the chessboard, and not citizens and actors in their own right. As a combination of conquest, trade, and religious conversion brought more and more people into contact, things began to change. Trade is the great cultural hybridizer and diffuser of tastes, social and political arrangements and beliefs. But trade also depends on the perception of difference, the observation that led David Ricardo to develop the doctrine of comparative advantage and of ways it can be profitably exploited. To begin with, to be sure, this was a very upper class sort of globalization, a kind of niche industry for the political class. To begin with, it was also perfectly compatible with the mercantilist world of power politics, in which there were always winners and losers, even if the logic of competition meant that it was only prudent to engage in exchange to avoid surrendering the technological initiative. But the development of long-distance trade did not immediately assume a global marketplace. Indeed, the original merchant companies not only traded under royal charter, but their operatives negotiated special treaties under which they were permitted to live separately from the host population. the system of capitulations which protected the subjects of the Western powers resident in Egypt is one kind of example of what I'm talking about. The Dutch trading station at Nagasaki after the expulsion of the Christians from Japan is another. The conclusions that I draw from this first story are threefold. First, that the origin of global consciousness has a very long prehistory. Secondly, national identity, although not the doctrine of nationalism, begins to take shape as part of this globalizing process. Looking back, one can detect the existence of proto-nations. Japan would be a good example from Asia, the countries of the Atlantic seaboard examples from Europe. But there's no doctrine of nationalism, namely that the political boundaries of the sovereign state should be congruent with the national boundaries of the population. Thirdly, the shift from personal to contractual relations came slowly and very unevenly. Today in the West, all aspects of social life, from the money we use to the conditions of sale printed on the back of our cereal packets, are cast in contractual form. And the practice has certainly spread globally. But there are many parts of the world where it must coexist with early and traditional patterns of behavior. One example which makes Western countries that have been targets of jihadist attack feel nervous is the Hawala system of financial transfers, which allegedly dates from the 8th century and is still widely used in the Islamic world. In the second story, we enter a more recognizable world of mass society, in which in theory the state belongs to the people. People everywhere, and not just the elite, are dependent on exchanges in a global marketplace. At the same time, the increasing material integration of the world, which has been hugely reinforced by modern social media, has sharpened rather than blunted the question of political and national identity. People have always moved around, and we have numerous records of medieval travelers, Japanese in Mexico, Italians in India, freed West African slaves in Europe, Spaniards washed up from the Armada in Ireland and so forth, who never returned to their home countries and disappeared into the general populations amongst whom they lived. Until relatively recently, assimilation was not a choice. It was the price that those who left home had to pay for survival. No longer. Now we're all like snails. We carry our identities, and if not actually our homes, around us wherever we go. No doubt in many circumstances that is a comfort, but it's also can be a curse, feeding a sense of paranoia and prejudice amongst the host population, and of exclusion, discrimination, and victimhood amongst migrants. Now, what has all this got to do, one might say, with the history of nationalism, spread of nationalism rather, and the history of freedom? The answer is not so complex as it may at first appear. Because nationalism in the West is still closely associated with the interwar period, it's still widely interpreted as reaction rather than progress. It's worth reminding ourselves, therefore, that the original connection between nationalism and emancipation. The French Revolution and later the rather slow extension of the franchise in Britain defined the nation as a community of citizens, not of bloodlines or ancestry. Of course, the issue was confused, but Mazzini's writings suggest how easily 19th century Democrats were able to combine ethnic and liberal principles without seeing the contradiction. The symbolic relationship between global integration and national awareness, forged before the era of nationalism, was continued and reinforced by the paradox of liberal imperial expansion. Until well after the Second World War, and until the European empires began to crumble, the reactions against the market order were largely homegrown, particularly when the market system failed, as in the 1930s. So long as the imperial system persisted, the contradiction between freedom and exclusive identity was held in check. People moved around, but not in sufficient numbers to pose a general threat to political order. Mass movement poses two challenges. The first is economic and political. In a period of economic austerity, it has allowed the far right to capture the symbolism of national identity and patriotism from liberals and social democrats, at least in many countries. The second dimension is ideational and may in the long run be more important. The presence of large numbers of people from different cultural backgrounds in Western societies who claim, as they have to, the same rights as everyone else, is seen by their opponents as exposing the false pretensions of universality which Western liberals have always claimed underlie Western values. There's no doubt, it seems to me, that the assertion of a set of universal and inalienable rights has a great transcultural appeal. At the same time, no sovereign government, other than those who signed the European Convention on Human Rights, has been prepared to surrender their monopoly of interpretation of how these rights should be applied within their own jurisdiction. It's fashionable to represent the Cold War as a Western Civil War, which was ultimately about which model of modernity, individual or collectivist, capitalist or communist, would shape the future. Nationalism, the proposition of one culture, one state, was sidelined in the doctrinal schism, but was nonetheless, I want to argue, central in two respects. The first was bureaucratic. The international system was organized into separate nation states. Difficult to see how it could be organized in any other way. Those who argue for the withering away of the nation as a result of globalization never succeed in saying what is to replace the tax base provided by a national community of citizens required to finance, for example, the sewage system of a city as large as Lisbon. The second is that whichever model of modernity was adopted, the state was meant to belong to the people. But once this claim is advanced, the question of who the people are becomes unavoidable, and the idea of the nation as a bounded and bonded community returns through the back door. The West, they say, won the Cold War, but only by default. In a sense, I think this was extremely unfortunate. The nation state may still be the unavoidable political form of the modern world, but the definition of what the nation is varies considerably, as we've heard over the last 2 days, across a spectrum from a community of citizens within a constitutional state at one end to one claiming to embody an extended biological and ethnic family at the other. In any period, the great powers invariably try to make over international society in their own image. So it should come as no surprise that the leading states in the West tried to insist that only the model of constitutional democracy was legitimate. It was a formula that was almost bound to miscarry and to produce perverse results, as the history of the last 2 decades across much of the global south surely attests. Nonetheless, we still occupy a world of would-be, if not always, convincing nation-states. The problem is that while there's no alternative in view, they are becoming, as we've heard, less coherent by the day, and are perceived in the West, certainly, not everywhere, but certainly in much of the West, as simultaneously less stable and more threatening. It's often argued that the main reason for this is the ease of modern communication. Very few countries are ethnically as homogeneous as they pretend. Some, like Japan, have been spectacularly successful in developing a culturally homogeneous society. But even Japanese ethnicity is composed of a genetic omelette. These days, however, the process of breaking eggs takes place in full view. It's no longer conveniently concealed by the amnesia of a necessary assimilation. In contrast, modern information technology simultaneously facilitates mass immigration while reducing the pressures on migrants to assimilate and the capacity of states to manage the flow. It is this loss of control during a time of economic bad weather that's fed the rise of the exclusivist far-right nationalists across Europe, going so far, unfortunately, from my point of view at any rate, in Britain, as to push the country into Brexit. So where are we heading, and what's the future of the nation in this trajectory? One conclusion from juxtaposing the 2 stories that I started with is that it makes sense to say that the nation, at least as a political form, is not eternal. If there was a time before the nation, logically, there can be a time after it. But since we have no experience of a post-national state, we cannot say what this might look like. 50 years ago, when I first started, and I think Albie's not here, so I think I probably am the oldest person in this room. 50 years ago, when I first started teaching, studying international relations, academics speculated about the development of what they called a new medievalism. I believe the term was first coined by Hedley Bull in the Anarchical Society, published in 1977, to suggest that we might be entering a period of overlapping jurisdictions, broadly analogous to those that existed in the West during the transition between feudalism and the centralized state. Modern institutions, like the then European Economic Community, modern political principles such as subsidiarity, the growth of multilateral regimes such as the human rights regime and many others, lend some credibility to this progressive worldview. But they too have contributed to widening the gap between the political and professional classes and the mass of the people, who are either apathetic or feel increasingly alienated from the liberal democratic framework. In yesterday's panel, one of which I thought was marvelous, the Empire panel, and the first one, the Human Rights panel, the one thing that disturbed me was the suggestion that the world would be a safer place if it was handed over to the intellectuals. I can see no evidence that the intellectuals wouldn't make an even worse mess of it than everybody else. So that was my one. I didn't have time to raise this doubt, but it seemed to me the one dangerous turn that we took in yesterday's panel. But as I say, they contributed to widening this gap between the political and professional classes and the mass of the people. So, but let's try, there are some grounds, I think, for optimism. In the past, expansionist nationalisms created empires, and this in turn generated anti-colonial nationalism. Formal empires no longer exist, and European decolonization is for all intents and purposes complete. The threat of general war between the great powers has not been eliminated, but has been greatly reduced. And the number of interstate wars fueled by nationalism has also declined. But there are also, unfortunately, grounds for pessimism, and we covered some of this yesterday. Violence has certainly not been ended, but in many parts of the world has been internalized, delegitimizing the state almost everywhere, and leading to brutal civil wars in some countries and discrimination against minorities and random terrorist attacks in others. So in conclusion, it's perhaps worth reminding ourselves of 2 points. First, there's still no realistic alternative to the sovereign state. Second, it's becoming increasingly incompetent because of globalization, but we don't have an alternative. Second, we have to live somewhere, and we are therefore bound to be imprinted by the culture that surrounds us. We know that it changes everywhere, but for the most part it changes very slowly. So it's worth reminding ourselves that national consciousness started not as a political movement, but as a cultural and conservationist one. It was the antiquarians, the folklorists, the collectors of folk music, and those determined to save threatened languages, who built up the resources that were later appropriated by the politicians. At a time when the importance of biodiversity is gradually being recognized, nationalists should perhaps return to their origins. Thank you.
We have general questions
so maybe
and more
we-
specific
right.
questions.
So maybe I'm happy
we
to
can
start,
have
but I think everybody probably has thoughts on these issues. So maybe to take the first question first, polarization. I mean, really, one of the main points of our book, and I believe this still. We wrote the book a few months ago and we finished it a few months ago, but I feel like the main point has been reinforced, which is that the problem in American politics is not just the election of Donald Trump. That the problem runs much deeper in American politics and in other political systems. And the chief problem, I think, is exactly the one that Jack mentioned, which is polarization. There's this incredible figure that's often cited now in these surveys that were done, asking people, how would you feel? How would you feel if your child married somebody of the other political party? Democrats and Republicans were asked this recently, and around 40% of Democrats and Republicans both report that they would be very dissatisfied if their child married somebody of the other political party. There's a similar question was asked, I think, actually by Gabriel Ullman and Sidney Verba in the early 1960s, and that figure was 4%. So there's been an increase, really, in intense polarization, animosity, fear, loathing. There's questions that around 40% of members of each party report being afraid of the other party in the United States. So these are measures of an intense polarization. Some polarization is good for democracy. People disagree. They should disagree about policies and priorities, but this kind of level of fear, animosity, loathing is really reached new levels in the United States that haven't been seen in the 20th century. So I think this is a problem that that existed before Donald Trump. It's a problem that will last beyond Donald Trump. And I think it's really driven, it's being driven by a lot of things, including perhaps economic difficulties and the slow economic growth, increasing economic inequality. But I think the actual real crux of the issue centers around a demographic change in the United States. And in many ways, we emphasize that the United States was not really a democracy until the mid-1960s, when voting rights were extended to African Americans, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act of the mid-1960s, increase in immigration in the 1960s, generated a series of realignments in American politics. In particular, the white Southern Democrats shifted to the Republican Party, African Americans primarily have supported the Democratic Party. Another big shift at the beginning of the mid-1970s, evangelical Christians had been evenly split between the Democratic and Republican Party. And after mid-1970s, really beginning in the 1980s, there's been a real shift to the Republican Party. So now there's two political parties in the United States. One, the Republican Party, is largely, not entirely, but largely a white Christian party. The Democratic Party is a rainbow coalition of seculars and some religious people, but also it's a real ethnically diverse political party in terms of its voting base. The fact that the Republican Party is primarily a white Christian party matters because white Christians are not just any group in the United States. I mean, they were historically the dominant group. They were every U.S. president, governors, news broadcasters, everybody in America, all leaders, at the top of all social hierarchies. So there's been a decline in the number of white Christians as a percentage of the American electorate, but they also a decline in status. And I think that this kind of demographic shift in many ways is behind a lot of the polarization between the two parties. This is clearly America has become more democratic as a result of these changes, and these are all to be applauded. But I guess the issue is to think about how in a context of slow economic growth, combined with these kind of changes, make the U.S. vulnerable to this kind of politics. I sometimes imagine a kind of a world in which these democratic changes that transformed and democratized the United States came, let's say, in 1948 rather than 1965, and had been followed. Had they been carried out in the late 1940s, there may have been 25 years of uninterrupted economic growth with growing middle class. But instead, what happened in the United States, an unfortunate accident of history in some ways, these democratizing reforms were introduced in the mid-1960s, and then beginning in the early 1970s, the global economy transformed, the oil crises, and there's been a period of slower economic growth since then. So this has contributed to this. So what this means at some level, and I'll sort of stop after this point here, is that I think the Republican Party needs to be refounded effectively, and needs to be refounded on a more diverse basis. And it's in many ways, it's hard. A single political party can't be a white Christian party in an increasingly diverse society. And so this is the way of addressing, I think, the polarization. And so, there are these problems of Donald Trump coming to power and the issues that I've talked about in my presentation. But at some level, the problems run much deeper and have to do with the transformation and democratization of the American society and American politics. And, we're sort of struggling through this today, I think. There's other questions people ask. I'd be happy to talk about the Austria-Italy thing, but maybe I'll first turn it over to others to have.
Question about polarization. I think, for instance, looking at the Portuguese case, I think Portugal has very much avoided polarization, and actually I do think there's a realignment with electoral preferences. If you ask people now, and in the past as well, about would they like if they would like this kind of a governmental coalition that it's in place now, people, the median voter would have supported this, has been supporting this for a long time. So there's a realignment and a conjunction with electoral preferences that has been expressed in surveys for many years. So in that sense, this contributes to diminishing of polarization. On the other hand, it depends on the evolution of the right. I think polarization in most Western liberal democracies has been driven by the shift to the right by mainstream right-wing parties. Under the pressure of populist, xenophobic parties, you don't have that kind of political party, a xenophobic populist party in Portugal now. So you would expect the center-right party, which has just actually during this weekend changed its leadership, to move to the center, because they're not facing, on the one hand, they're not facing a competitor from the right. On the other hand, they change their leadership in a way that rejects neoliberalism, and they declare, the new leadership, that they want to go back to their kind of social democratic and personalistic Christian roots. So maybe you would expect a realignment towards the center. So so if this is the Portuguese pattern, so alignment on convergence on the left and and moving an evolution towards the center by the right. So what are the origins of this? And I do think there are three roots of this. You have to look at the period of the late 60s and early 70s, where these predisposition by political elites were established. One is I think that's a topic, this is just an hypothesis which I will pursue, but I think the experience of exile during the dictatorship was important even for the center left in Portugal. Whereas in Spain, the main political figures of the center left, of socialism, were oppositionists to the Franco regime, which were inside Spain. They lived in Spain. And whereas in Portugal, it was the people who were in exile who became the dominant people, like Mário Soares in the center left. So the people who were in exile, in the case of Portugal, they were much more in contact with what's going on in international socialism. So Soares was working in the International Socialist with Willy Brandt. He became good friends with Mitterrand, and he was in Chile during the Allende experience. So he kind of learned, and also because he had a kind of a communist background, he had been before in the Communist Party, contrary to the Spanish socialists, the leaders of the Spanish socialists. So he had an experience both as both a communist and a socialist throughout his life. And also by watching the common program being built by the French socialists and the communists in France, he kind of implemented that experience in Portugal in the later phases of the dictatorship and during the first year of the revolution. It was him who legalized the Communist Party, actually, against the military, some part of the military. So this is, I think, a much neglected part of the history. The second aspect, it's the revolution contributed to make the Portuguese right a much more centrist and even left-leaning right than it's normally in most democratic countries. So because of just the system was just so geared to the left that you didn't, for the first years of democracy, you didn't have a right. Everybody was on the left. So the center right wanted to be part of an international socialist, and they call themselves social democrats. So it's a different party system. Compared, for instance, to the ones in Eastern Europe, which are all geared to the right, or tend to be more geared to. You have liberals, or Ireland, for instance, where the identities are much more right-wing in the party spectrum. So historically, this was a party system much more geared to the left, and I do think that the right will reconfigure itself and move towards the center in the next years. So we won't have polarization, I think.
James, you had a question from Jack.
I think my answer is simply yes, but if I could link it to the question on whether the far right in power is weak or strong, I think this may partly be affected by electoral system. I'm no kind of expert here, so I will defer. I mean, in the United States and in Britain, we have different but both first past the post kind of systems which favor, under certain circumstances, polarization. I mean, I'm very interested in this. Certainly when I go to the States now, I feel this visceral polarization in a way that I didn't. But Daniel, I think in my experience, is right. That most of my American friends until the last 15 years when I got very close to a traditional conservative Republican. Previously, I only knew Democrats. And if I had to say one thing about sort of democratic mindset in the United States, coming to it from outside, is that the Democrats always said that the Republicans were stupid. It was a sort of knee-jerk reaction. It couldn't have been true, but it was there. There was always that degree of polarization, but it didn't stop cutting deals on the Hill. And that seems to me what has broken. If I link that, now I've got a question to Daniel, really, which links with this question of whether far-right parties in power are weak or strong. because in Daniel's account, there was a kind of unbroken tradition, if I'm right, going from the collapse of Weimar, the rise of National Socialists and so on, to what may be happening now. The difference, I think, is that if you get far-right parties in power now, they come in coalitions under various forms of proportional voting. And the business of government is boring. That's the argument. They get, in opposition, they can thump the table and make extreme things. In power, they have to take all these rather low-level administrative decisions, and they lose interest. That's the optimistic way of describing it. The question that I have, and I'll come to Jack back, if I may, to Jack's question in a minute, but the question I have is whether in the fascist and National Socialist period, these movements were backed by doctrine. It was lousy doctrine. I mean, it didn't make sense. But it was there. It was, you had the cult of violence. You had the sort of appeal to a long tradition and so on. So the question really is, when everyone now says, what's the new model of authoritarian government? Is it Peronist? I mean, what is to sustain the new authoritarian rulers? That would be my question. In Britain, I think the answer simply, Jack, is yes. From 1945 onwards, we had, even when we had governments of the right, you had a sort of social democratic consensus. And you had, in a way, the nationalism was taken for granted. It was a kind of Danegeld state. You kept that's why the National Health Service is such an important, you can't really, even if you don't like it on the right, you can't get rid of it. Now that begins to crack under Mrs. Thatcher, when Mrs. Thatcher sort of destroys British industry effectively, loses all power in Scotland, and seems to be there forever. And so when New Labour comes back in, Tony Blair, who had no interest in constitutional reform, really, becomes the great constitutional reformer. Because in order to stop this leeching away of conservative voters, well, Labour voters rather, to the Scottish National Party, he allows the Scottish Assembly the first time for 300 years with powers of taxation and so on. And that begins the process of polarization, which ends, I won't go on, but which ends with the Brexit referendum, which is undoubtedly polarized British society, because it's the right managed, the right wing of the Conservative Party managed to, as it were, shore itself up against the United Kingdom Independence Party, but it monopolized the symbols of nationalism, and you've now got a completely divided country, in my view. So the simple answer is yes.
Oh, could I say
Yes,
one more
please,
thing? Yeah,
course,
so
go
I
ahead.
didn't get to. Yeah, so to follow up on this point, to answer your question, also the question about, should you work with them or not work with them? I mean, I think this is this incredible dilemma for which there's no easy answers. But I guess one point I would make, and this gets to your point about doctrine, I think it's very important to distinguish between political groups whose program one might not like. So it's very possible, I'm no fan of the Austrian Freedom Party. But it's not clear to me that the Austrian, and I disagree with their stance on immigration and think that they're motivated by racism in many instances. But it's not clear. I mean, I don't know. I mean, somebody could correct me and we could debate this. To what degree they are an anti-democratic party? Are they in fact violating democratic norms and constitutional kind of reform? Is this what's happening? And so I think at the red line for me is the political leader or is the politician a genuine threat to democracy, meaning they want to undermine democratic institutions and expressed a willingness to do this and an interest in doing this. If they have, then I think under no conditions should they be allowed into government. I mean, politicians should make, they obviously have the right to run for office, but politicians need to say this is unacceptable. And so that's part of the point about them having a doctrine and a plan. If they are simply, reflecting views that one disagrees with, again, maybe one doesn't vote for them, or one hopes that parties don't form coalitions with them. I mean, I think the Austrian, but but it's a different matter. So I think, the issue of Berlusconi, that's another kind of interesting story. I think so. It's important to kind of make this distinction, I think, between unappealing policies and anti-democratic policies. And at the end of the day, that's really the challenge, is to make that distinction, and it's sometimes hard to see the difference, I guess, and it's a constantly evolving thing. And so but I think at some level we have to give populists the benefit of the doubt that they are genuine Democrats unless they prove otherwise.
My question will be to Professor Tiago, and specifically about his argument, which I believe is quite specific to the Portuguese case, but nevertheless, I'd like to raise a couple of questions. The first one is that you focused the issue of big change, or at least the big crisis was supposed to be the unifier between these the three parties to this broad coalition. Indeed, my point would be that a sort of a broad coalition had been tried before in '87, but failed in 1987 with the Socialist Party, with the Young's Party, and with support of the Communists. So my question would be that the failure of that alliance, so to speak, was due to a lack of significant crisis, or to individual political motivations, meaning Suarez's refusal of collaborating with the Communists. And the second one would be, how could this argument be relevant to other Southern European countries, for instance, the case of Spain, where the center-left party wasn't much more into the issue of austerity or in government during austerity. It was similar to the Portuguese case, yet nevertheless it significantly lost its voters and its members. So how could this be useful to other cases, specifically perhaps the Spanish case?
Congratulations to all. There were some great presentations today. Just two quick questions. One regarding the new European trends of creating European mechanisms of defense or European budgets. So how would this trend affect the democracies of European states, and how would this bring nationalisms back to countries that actually don't have it yet, because they are seeing lots of power going through Europe and they're not very interested in that? If you could enlighten me on that, would be great. Second question about Trump. Compared to other leaders that were actually more dangerous or could be dangerous, do you think he has like a political agenda or a political background that will make it consistently dangerous? Or do you think, as I think, that he's kind of an emotional person that kind of responds to stimulus and that has a really good background in marketing or managing people, and he actually knows how to sell him, but his political background is quite not very consistent?
I am Eduardo Viola from the University of Brasilia. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I have a question for Daniel. Maybe it's difficult, but could you, right now, I mean 2018, could you elaborate on what would be the criteria for differentiating a right wing that is loyal to democracy and someone that is really trying to destroy or dramatically undermine democracy? I am very interested in applying this to the present situation in Brazil. Okay? If you are aware about the situation enough to have some reflections about this, for example, how much the left is right now not anymore loyal to democracy, how the right wing that has emerged in the past 2 years is loyal to democracy or not, is under democracy. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you for your speeches. My question is addressed to Professor James Mayall, and it's concerning one interesting topic that you pointed out at the end, which is the nation as a political form is not necessarily a permanent form, because if it had a before, it can also have an after. And you suggested that we could be seeing a new medievalism because of the overlapping jurisdiction. And trying to make a link with yesterday's panel, we also talked about the Roman law and how important it was in creating the absolutism. And with my incipient and limited knowledge, I think that after the birth of the Leviathan and with the social contract, and yeah, the individuals are way more binded than the organs from the Ständerstaat in the Middle Age were before, so also the institutions are. So, and with this rule of law and the existence of constitutions are put institutions and individuals way more limited. So I wanted to know your thoughts about this tension between modern centralized states and this middle.
As a teacher, I think I'll make myself heard. I have two questions, one specifically on Portugal, and to try to put Tiago's argument in context. Your argument is not to apply to the 83-85 crisis, when the huge economic crisis in Portugal did not lead to a coalescence of the left, but on the contrary, on the forming of a coalition in the center of the two larger parties in the center. So thus the argument of the crisis as an agent for the coalition of the lefts stand or are these very contingent processes. For instance, if the leader of the Socialist Party had not been replaced, yes, recently before Antonio Costa, we probably wouldn't have any kind of this solution. So aren't these very contingent more than these structural explanations you offer? Second question, a more general one. I think the question of the far right and their democracy reliance or not. We have, of course, now, because even in Europe, the European Union is a kind of a defense against that. No far-right movements claiming that they do not want a formal democratic regime. But there is something, democracy is not just the vote of the majority, it's the respect for the minority. And in this matter, of course, there are a lot of questions that can be raised on the democratic nature of this far-right movement. These movements, along with other populist movements which are very difficult to classify and which emerge on the sequence of the implosion of many democratic and party systems, have brought something which is the politics against politicians. And the way that they build, and now using the social media, they bring this delegitimation of politicians. And there are political movements, especially directed at the legitimation of politicians. And the issue of corruption is being used, of course, it's an issue. But it's being used in this kind of light. You didn't mention this, so I would like to see your point of view on this matter. Thank you.
Now I'll just be back to my role as chair of the panel, and we had very interesting, challenging questions from our audience, an average of 2 per participant, which is very good. Thank you. But now I'm going to ask the members of the panel, please be brief as possible. We'll have a long afternoon ahead of us, so just pick the key issues, and then we'll bring this panel to an end. So I would start with Tiago and then end with James Mayall and João if he wants, João Silveira if he wants to offer a comment. Thank you.
Okay, very briefly, starting with George's question, I do think that the crisis in the mid 85 to 87 was very different from this one. Although one has had economic crisis throughout the Portuguese democratic period, also in 78, and three IMF interventions actually. But the previous IMF interventions to this one in 2011, the IMF wasn't espousing a clear neoliberal agenda as it was today. So the threat or the challenge to democracy was much stronger in this present crisis. Also because the IMF was really, governing. Ruling the political system here, whereas in the past it was the government still had room to maneuver whether to implement the directives that the IMF was espousing here. So it's a different. It was an economic crisis now, but it was also an institutional and political, so to say, occupation of the country by foreign, so a system of, a kind of a neo-colonial system. I'm exaggerating a bit. Whereas in the past, the previous interventions had not had that character. Regarding the questions, again, why did it fail also in the same period? I mean, this is part of the answer, I think. But also in 87, it was more an issue of elite preferences and without civil society pressure for left-wing agreements. Now, what differentiates this period from the period you mentioned is that you had, before the government, the left-wing government being formed in 2015, you have since 2011 to 2014, 2015, a process of building up progressive coalitions in civil society where parties gradually adapt to these, and sections and groups within each political party respond to pressures from civil society. So, for instance, during this period of 2011 to 2015, one had 4 general strikes, which is the same number of general strikes you had throughout the whole democratic period. But these general strikes, they're all called together and organized together by the 2 main union confederations, which had only happened once in the democratic period, which was during the revolution, the transition revolution. And there was also another one in the mid-80s, actually. Also, unions cooperate with precarious movements organizing precarious workers and other women's movements, local governments, etc. And they build up these coalitions in civil society. And that's the difference, I think.
So when you said be brief, you were looking right at me. You were looking right at me. So I'm going to I'm going to take you very literally. So point number 1: Donald Trump has no master plan to implement authoritarianism, and that's good news. Point number 2: but that doesn't mean he's not a threat. And the way one distinguishes between politicians who are just offensive and politicians who are a threat, I think, come back to the 4 points that I mentioned in my talk, but I'll make them again. 1, if politicians attack the democratic rules of the game, in some way question whether they're legitimate. Number 2, if politicians attack the legitimacy of their rivals, and in some way question whether or not they have a right to compete, exist, or govern, by baselessly accusing your rivals of being criminal or agents of foreign powers. Point number 3, whether they tolerate violence, encourage violence, tolerate violence, is beyond the pale. And point number 4, do they express a willingness to curtail civil liberties? And in particular, do they go after, for example, the media, but other forms of civil liberties? So if a politician does any of these 4 things, in my view, in our book, they're a threat to democracy. But they're a threat to democracy not only because they might do those things once in power, but also they're a threat to democracy because when politicians speak this way, they generate a backlash. The opposition is rightly fearful, and the opposition then begins to take extreme measures as well. And the thing that that we're most fearful of is the sense that there might be a kind of spiral, a death spiral, in which each side responds in increasingly nasty ways, and in which each side views the other side as not being a legitimate contender for power. And it's exactly that kind of spiral that usually leads to democratic breakdown. And so words matter in this sense, because they provoke a bad reaction.
Whether fears of European budgets are feeding the rise of resurgence of nationalism. I mean, the interesting thing is that the EU was, or the EEC as it then was sometimes represented as a mechanism for getting over the disgrace of European nationalism between the wars. And that has worn thin. I'm not sure that, I mean, you're quite right, in the Brexit campaign, the big lie was the bus which went out across the country was saying that the money we would save from the EU budget would go straight into the National Health Service. The one thing that mustn't be sacrificed. It was a lie, it was admitted to be a lie even before the end of the campaign. But the damage had been done. But I think you needed something more. I mean, budgets are quite difficult to get your mind around, and a lot of what we're talking about is this difference between the elite, which has been not just the politicians, but the professional elite, which has been delegitimized, and including the politicians, and the mass of ordinary people who think it doesn't matter who's in office, but it's all the same. And I think, the key thing was this feeling, again, of that very old argument, our houses, our places in the doctor's queue are being stolen by the immigrants. That was the trigger. You had to put that together with the budget before you got this sort of tinder, which would explode. I wasn't saying that the new medievalism is about. I'm not sure that it does. Well, I think we stand, as I'm pinching from a colleague, I mean, we stand in relation to the internet, the new technology, rather like people would have stood in relation to the printing press 50 years after the Guggenheim Bible. We know it's having a massive effect on society, but we've no idea how. And in a way, the new medievalism, something's got to break so that something like that could emerge. But I was impressed by yesterday's panel. I mean, the lawyers all talked, I don't know whether any of you noticed, but they all talked the language of rights. Nobody talked about obligations, nobody talked about enforcement. So you had regimes, and I was thinking just now when you asked your question, that after the end of the Cold War, the language of politics changed very much. People stopped talking about government and started talking about governance. That somehow the world was on automatic pilot. It would be, this is the liberal internationalist view. So these regimes would somehow manage themselves. They would just, by their internal rationality, would work. And I think that's, I wish that was true, but I think the tensions between the resistance of not giving away authority and the world in which you have less and less competence because things can happen beyond your jurisdiction, which will, and this happens even in the United States now. China perhaps has a national economy which corresponds with the state, but almost nobody else does. And that's the big incoherence and ungovernability that we have to live with. Thank you.
Well, no. So I would invite you to join me in joining your hands and giving a warm thank you.